Okay, we are live. Welcome to VisugXL, the second edition of our annual conference. We hope that everyone is safe and with our event. We hope to bring some fun and extra knowledge. During the different sessions this afternoon, you can use a chat window to share info with other attendees. Please use a dedicated Q&A tab to ask specific questions to the speaker. We will try to cover a few of these questions at the end of the session. Also, please rate our sessions. You will be able to rate the sessions after it's finished. And now, with further ado, let's get started with the first session.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Welcome to this session at the Visual Studio User Group. And in this session, we're going to talk about API authentication. And to keep it a little bit less dry, we're going to talk about recipes for API authentication. We're going to talk about a few different options, and we're going to see where we end up at the end. Before we dive into the details, let me maybe first define, or very informally define, authentication and authorization, because that's essentially what we will be talking about. When we talk about authentication, we talk about a party proving their identity. So if you talk about this in a real world scenario, this would be a person claiming to be Philippe De Ryck. Anybody can make that claim, but if somebody asks you to back that claim up with authentication, you'll have to show some form of proof. And typically in the real world, that would be an identity card or a passport that actually states who you are with a picture, allowing someone to verify that identity. That's authentication. Usually in API security, we talk about authentication, but we really want to do authorization. We really want to talk about whether something is allowed, whether somebody who is claiming to be a certain client or a certain user is allowed to perform a certain operation. And authentication in that sense is only a means to an end. It's about that authorization decision, about deciding if something is allowed, yes or no. By itself, this sounds fairly straightforward, right? Like, it's not that difficult to determine who someone is, so we should be able to figure that out and get that done. And you're not wrong. If you look at a simple setup with a client and an API, this is indeed not very complicated, because you have a client application, you may have a user, you may not have a user, and you have an API, and you can figure out some way to verify someone's identity. However, the moment you start talking about different clients, you have mobile clients, you have single page applications in the browser, you have native applications, desktop apps, and so on, things get a little bit more tricky. If you look at the API side of things, you'll quickly see that it's not one API, but there's going to be multiple APIs involved, and you'll have to authenticate to each of these APIs. Take it a step further, build a microservice architecture, or even a service architecture. Doesn't have to be micro in that sense, but you'll have APIs calling other APIs and making those requests. And if that happens, one of the calling APIs becomes a client application to the caller API as well. So these are definitely things that complicate this whole question, this whole scenario of authenticating to an API so that the API can make authorization decisions. It's even more complicated because sometimes there will be a user involved. For example, if you have a client running on a user's machine, such as a mobile app running on my phone, typically the client will have to authenticate in my name and not as a client itself. Similarly, on the backend, if you have service-to-service communication, it's often a service communicating to the other service without involvement of a user. So you have two different flavors. You can even have a mix of both flavors together. And that's essentially why this is a bit of a complex topic and why I'm going to be talking about this for 45 to 50 minutes, giving you all kinds of different options to enable some of these scenarios. Just listing these is going to be dry. I'll try to make it less dry, and I'll try to make it as fun and entertaining as possible. And to start doing that, I want to pull in the recipe part. So why recipes for authentication? Well, actually, because I'm a chef. During my PhD in web security, I went to evening school to learn how to cook better, and that eventually resulted in me getting my chef's degree. So I wanted to bring part of that life into this presentation as well. We're going to talk about very simple and effective API techniques, API authentication techniques, which is like this delicious slice of pizza. It's not fancy, it doesn't look that great, but it's absolutely delicious if you're a fan of pizza. That's a good thing. We're also going to talk about fancy options. We're going to talk about fine dining. If you're ever able to travel again, which will be somewhere hopefully next year, you can go to a special restaurant like Tickets in Barcelona, where you have super fancy food, which you can definitely enjoy. We're going to talk about different API authentication techniques, which represent bare bones gets the job done versus fancy additional features and so on. There's also another kind of authentication technique, something you wish you never saw in practice. We're not going to talk about that here. I'll leave that out. Just forget you ever saw that. Or if you like it, there's a great subreddit with shitty food porn. You should definitely check it out. If you ever looked up recipes in the modern world on a website, you've noticed that recipes start with someone's life story, right? First of all, you get like 2 pages of background information before you get to the juicy part, the actual recipe. So I'm going to follow the same structure here, and I'm going to talk about myself before we talk about API authentication. I'll keep it short. It's not going to be 2 pages, 1 slide and 1 slide only. I'm Philippe De Ryck. I'm from Belgium. This would have been a local event, but since everybody's stuck at home, it's still local, but not as local as you may have imagined. I did a PhD in web security. And since a few years, I'm running my own company called Pragmatic Web Security. And what I mainly do there is training, academic level security training for developers, for project managers, and so on, along with online courses and very specific consulting to help companies build better and more secure applications. That's basically me in a nutshell. If you want to know more, there's a website, link right at the bottom next to my picture, where you can find a bit more information about me. Enough about me. Let's talk about the pizza slice of API authentication, basic client authentication. These techniques are the quick and dirty mechanisms, something that works, but will have some drawbacks along the way. And one starting point is working with a shared secret. So here on the left, you see a client with a certain secret, and you have an API that has that same secret. And with that value, we can implement some form of authentication. So essentially, the client will send a request to the API. That's the conceptual idea, including that secret. The API will verify that secret with the secret it has stored somewhere or hard-coded somewhere, and will give a proper response. Very simple, very quick, but it gets the job done if that's what you need in practice. How do you implement this concept in practice? This is the idea. What's the implementation part? Well, one example would be the use of HTTP basic auth. This is something that has been around since the 90s. If you're old enough to remember that, you will have remembered these browser pop-ups asking for a username and a password. That is the browser variation of basic auth. Basic auth is an authorization header embedded in the request. It's a request header with the type basic and a value. That value, if you would look up the spec, or if you know what the value is, it's a base64 encoding of a username : password. This enables user authentication if you want to. It will be a username, Philippe, and a password, Belgian fries are awesome. That would be one example. But it can also be a client identifier or a client secret. What matters is that the API receives these credentials and can verify them against a set of stored credentials somewhere on the server. Shared secret, simple, straightforward. All right. How else can this work? Well, you can find alternative solutions which have different names but are essentially the same mechanism, just sending the secret directly as an API key. We often encounter these in service-to-service communication. You include an API key in a custom header or in an authorization header or somewhere, even in the body of a request. That's possible. That API key is again a shared secret. It's a secret known by the sender and the receiver, allowing the receiver to determine who the sender really is. Brings us to the first recipe. Each of the recipes we're going to talk has this recipe card, which summarizes the information, makes it easy for you to look at this after the presentation or as a reference. The slides are available on my website, and I've uploaded them to the platform here as well. I'm not sure if they become available, but you'll be able to find them. So shared secret, examples are basic auth in HTTP or API keys. It's a secret known by all involved parties. What are some of the pros, the benefits of this approach? It's very lightweight, minimal overhead. It's like just send a value and you're done. Very easy to implement. And this actually works well within a single trust zone. A trust zone is like a very informal concept. It basically means if you have a client and an API that kind of trust each other and want to make sure that they're the only ones communicating, an API key could be a very effective way to implement such a simple mechanism. What are some of the drawbacks? Well, the secret has to be known by all parties involved. This means that it doesn't scale very well. If you want to have one client talk to 5 APIs, then either you'll have 5 different secrets, or you'll have 5 or 6 parties that know this one secret, which basically means that the more people that know the secret, the less valuable your authentication mechanism becomes. So it's going to be a trade-off whether this will work in practice, yes or no. Another drawback here is that the secret is not linked to the request in any way. It's basically just a token, so well, not really a token, just a value you send around. And if somebody obtains that value and attaches it to another request, that request will also be considered authenticated, even though it would be invalid. So let's see if we can do something about some of these challenges in a more advanced mechanism. The more advanced mechanism is still based on that shared secret. So we're not going to solve all problems here. I still need some content for the rest of this presentation, but we can solve a few of them. Instead of just sending the secret along with the request in a header or whatever, we're going to use it to calculate an HMAC. And an HMAC is a form of signature, and we calculate that HMAC on the request. I'm going to discuss HMACs in a bit more detail in the next slide, but I'm going to walk through the mechanism first. So the client calculates an HMAC using the secret and sends that HMAC along with the request. And the API can now verify that HMAC instead of verify the secret directly. So the secret itself is not sent over the wire, only that HMAC is sent over the wire here, or the wireless in some cases. All right. How does this work in practice? Well, one example would be including an HMAC in a custom request header. The XRECSIG, the request signature header, something custom made up, even made up in PowerPoint in this case, but you kind of get the idea. The API can verify the HMAC to determine that the sender is indeed the client who claims to be the client, and that the request is valid in this case. So how does this work in practice? What's the theory behind, well, not the theory, the mechanism behind HMACs, which takes us into the world of cryptography. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about the math part. I'm going to talk about the security properties part, which is basically what we're looking for here. So we have an HMAC. An HMAC is a cryptographic function. So very smart people have built some of these HMACs and they work. That's all you need to know about an HMAC function. How it works is not too important for this part. If you're interested in that, I will not be able to help you there. You'll have to find someone who knows about the specifics of HMAC functions. An HMAC function takes 2 inputs. The first input is going to be data, in this case, request data. So we feed certain parts of the request into the HMAC function along with a secret. That secret is a key that makes this calculated HMAC unique to this input and this secret. The result is, in this case, SHA-256, which involves a secret. So it's not a plain hash, but it's an HMAC hash using the SHA-256 function. And that HMAC is the thing that you send along with a request to the API in this case. So the API receives the request and an HMAC. Before the API does anything with that request, it should verify that HMAC. How does it do that? Well, it recalculates the same function using the same input and the same secret value. And out comes a new HMAC. That new HMAC, the API can compare that to the one that has been received from the client. So the API now has 2 HMACs and compares them, just a simple string comparison, nothing more. And if they match, then the API knows that the input to the HMAC was identical to the input that the client used. Basically, the request data was identical and the secret was identical. So if this client claims to be client X with secret Y, the API has now verified that that claim is true. If something doesn't add up, if something doesn't match, then something has changed. Either the data has changed or the secret has changed. In reality, we typically don't care what has changed. We just reject the request and state it as invalid. That's the basic concept of an HMAC. So by applying that HMAC to a request mechanism here, we can perform certain forms of authentication. We can assert that the client has possession of the secret that the API also knows. This mechanism is used in practice quite a bit. One example is Amazon AWS. AWS has a request signing mechanism. In this request signing mechanism, you're basically required to sign a request being sent to certain services to ensure that it's a proper request coming from a legitimate client. In this case, you can see that in line 4, 5, and 6, this is basically a custom authorization header added or specified by Amazon itself. They have AWS signing version 4. I'll have a link to this documentation at the end of the presentation, by the way. They identify the credential, that's the key being used to generate the signature, which headers they included, and then the signature value itself. This is very much alike the mechanism that I explained in the intermezzo. One implementation in practice just added to a header. There's another implementation mechanism you could use, which is more custom or more elaborate even, and that's the use of a JSON Web Token. JSON Web Tokens are JSON data structures with a signature, and what you could do is you could generate a JSON Web Token on the client and sign it with a secret key. Next, you send that JSON Web Token along with the request, for example, in a custom request header, and the API will be able to verify the signature on that JSON Web Token. That gives the API two things. First of all, it gives the API certainty that this client has possession of that secret value, and it also gives the API additional data, metadata about this request. Let me explain to you what that means in practice. This slide shows you an example of a JSON Web Token. Very simple piece of data with 3 different parts. There's a dot on the first line and a dot on the second to last line, separating the header, the payload, and the body. If you split such a token out, if you decode that token using a tool like jwt.io, you'll get the thing you see on the right. What you basically do is you base64 decode that token. The header and the payload are simply base64 encoded, so you can easily read that value. The interesting part is the payload, the purple one, the middle, because that contains the data of this token. So what we're basically receiving from the client is a set of information, a set of claims, which can include additional information about the request, basically anything that the client sees fit to include in that JSON Web Token. The header on top defines the algorithm used to sign the token. In this case, it says HS256. That's an HMAC using SHA-256 as the hashing algorithm. The blue part at the bottom is a signature. The signature in a JSON Web Token can be an HMAC, just like we described in the previous slides. The data for the HMAC is the header and the payload, and of course a secret value, which is super secret HMAC key in this example, which is not a very good HMAC secret. Anyway, apart from the hard-coded secret on this presentation here, what's happening here is that we are providing data with a signature, giving the API the necessary information. It's very similar to the request header signature, just a different format and a more open format, allowing you to specify additional information as the contents of that token. So what do we have here? Another recipe. We have HMAC-based authentication. What we're basically doing is we're calculating some form of a signature called an HMAC over a piece of request data. By doing so, we don't have to send the data or the secret over the wire. We only have to send the HMAC. It gives the same security properties. The API can still verify whatever it wants to verify. It can verify that the client possesses the secret and that the data has not been changed in the meantime. Benefits. HMACs provide authenticity and integrity. Good. It's still relatively easy to implement, mainly because of that shared secret, which is a good and a bad thing. In this case, it's a good thing because it makes it straightforward to implement that. One of the benefits here is that the signature can now be tied to a request. If you include the URL or the request parameters as data for the HMAC, then taking that signature and adding it to a different request will not work anymore. And that might be a good security property for this mechanism. Drawbacks? Well, we still haven't solved the scalability issue. If you still have a client talking to 5 different APIs, you would still need to have either 5 different secrets or shared secrets along all of these, which is, by the way, a very bad idea. Additional drawback, The verification of the HMAC, this is not typically not a mechanism you'll find that's implemented in a library, so you'll have to implement this as application code yourself, which may be a bit challenging in practice. At the very least, it's security sensitive code, so it's something that you might want to take into account to audit very carefully to make sure it's actually valid, especially if you're using JOTs, because there's a lot of implementation mistakes you can make when using JSON Web Tokens. All right, that concluded the pizza part of API authentication. For the people just joining in, I know that doesn't make sense, but if you go back to the beginning, we talked about pizza, fancy food, and really crappy food. So we're going to talk about more advanced mechanisms, which is basically the fine dining of API authentication next. By the way, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the Q&A. I will follow up on these at the end of the session if we have a bit of time left for that. All right, how can we make API authentication more advanced? What can we do to make things better? Well, we can get rid of that shared secret. That shared secret is something that we typically don't like to see because it only works well within a single trust zone. The moment you have less trust between parties or multiple parties involved, it's going to break very easily or it's going to become very insecure. A better mechanism is the use of public-private keys, a key pair. Public-private keys are two special keys. Well, it's two keys that belong together. One part is private. That's the stuff you keep private. You don't share with anyone. And one part is public. That's the part you can share with anyone you want to have that key. You can even publish it on the internet. That's perfectly fine. How can we use that for authentication? Well, in a very similar way as we use an HMAC, just with different components involved. We still generate a signature, but now we generate a signature with a private key. Only the client holding the private key will be able to generate a signature. We send a request along with that signature to an API. The API now uses the public key of the client to verify that signature, giving it the necessary information and allowing it to handle the request as it is expected to do so. This mechanism is also known as a proof of possession mechanism. The client is essentially proving possession of a private key to another party, which functions in this case as authentication because the client is the only one supposed to have that private key. You've all been using this all the time basically because TLS, HTTPS is based on this exact mechanism. Whenever you establish a connection with a server, that server has a private key and your browser is verifying whether that the certificate, the public key belonging to that private key is valid to verify or to verify a signature. So basically you're verifying that the server possesses a private key, which is why I cannot claim to be Amazon because I don't have Amazon's private key. All right. Why does this work? Well, again, because of digital signatures in this case, because of that specific signing function. So the client, in this case, has a private key and uses a sign function from an algorithm, typically such as RSA. That's one example. The sign algorithm takes two inputs again. It takes the data as input and a private key as input, and out comes the actual signature. Very simple, very straightforward. In our example, we could, for example, sign a challenge, or more realistically, we sign pieces of the request, proving to the API that we actually possess that private key. When we send the request, we send the data of the request, obviously, along with the signature to the API. The API has the public key, and it's going to use a verify function of the algorithm to make sure that the signature is valid. There's typically no manual comparison involved here. It's a verify function that takes three inputs, the signature, the data, and the public key, and it spits out one specific result, true or false. Very simple, very straightforward. By the way, this only works with the right public key. So you may have different public keys, but you need that specific public key that is uniquely linked to this client's private key. That's when this actually results in a green result or the true value. That means that the data is the same data as the client fed as input to the signature function. It ensures that the signature from the client actually belongs to this data and this public key. So it tells you that the client is indeed who they claim to be, and that the data that you received has not been modified in transit, that's the exact data that has been signed by the client. If this doesn't work, then something changed. Either you're trying to verify the wrong data, the input is wrong, or the public key is a mismatch. This can happen. When this happens, for example, in TLS, you'll get these big scary warnings like, no, something is really wrong. Let's get out of here. In this case, we probably just reject the request and tell the client to try again if the client is non-malicious. All right. That's the intermezzo. So how does this work in practice? Well, again, there's different implementation schemes you can follow to make this happen. One example is very similar to the Amazon example from before, and it uses the HTTP signature specification. So there's a not well-known specification for HTTP, a very, very recent addition that supports a signature header, much like the custom header that Amazon is using with their HMAC mechanism. You can see this header on line 4 and 5. What we're doing in this header is basically providing the metadata, like a key identifier, the algorithm we have used to generate the signature, when we did that, and what headers we included, along with the actual signature, which is, by the way, a lot longer than what I put on the slide here. When the API receives this value, the API now knows which fields of the request have been used to generate the signature. They can look up the proper key using the key identifier, verify that signature with the verify function of the proper algorithm, and make sure that this request is valid before they process that request. You'll often find a mechanism like this implemented between backend services to ensure that requests coming from one API going to another are indeed valid and coming from a legitimate API in that architecture. A second way to implement this would be with JSON Web Tokens. This is, again, a custom solution, not something I recommend you just start building from scratch, but this is something that we'll come back to later in the final part of this presentation in a different setting. So I want to cover this right here because it actually makes sense to talk about this now. The mechanism is the same as we talked about before. You generate a JOT on the client, you include the necessary metadata as the payload, and you sign it with a private key. JSON Web Tokens have built-in support for asymmetric signatures, so it's perfectly possible to do that with a JSON Web Token. Next, you send that to the server. In this case, we added it in the authorization header with the type bearer, which just means here's a value that authorizes this request, and that value is the JSON Web Token generated by the client. Just like before, the server will be able to verify the signature on that JSON Web Token using the right public key. And after that signature has been validated, the server can use the metadata in the token to authorize or to make an authorization decision. And that brings us to another recipe, the use of asymmetric request signatures, which is basically digital signatures generated with a private key and verified with a public key. You can see where this is going, right? The benefits, we no longer have shared secrets. Awesome. You have one private key for a client and everybody else can have the public key. Perfectly fine. You have one client that needs to talk to 15 APIs, one private key, one public key, and 15 APIs will be able to verify incoming calls from that client. Another benefit is that many client solutions or operating systems, for example, have support to manage cryptographic keys. So you can, for example, store keys easily in mobile devices and protect them with biometrics such as a fingerprint, which makes it easier to secure that secret on the client. Drawbacks? Well, if you've ever worked with something like this, you know that key management or deciding if a key is trusted is your main challenge here. So if you talk to a cryptographer, they have this famous saying that we never solve problems, we just move problems. So in this case, they moved the authentication problem from authenticating the client to trusting the key. And essentially, it becomes maybe a bit easier or different, but it's a similar problem to solve. Having a signature only does not offer anything except authenticity and maybe some integrity. There's no confidentiality in this mechanism. This means that there's no way to protect the data on the wire unless you use something like TLS as the baseline, which should be the default, which is interesting because that brings us to the next mechanism, which is kind of the holy grail of protecting server-to-server communication. All right, so what is that holy grail? That holy grail is mutual TLS or MTLS. MTLS uses more keys because more keys is usually better. Well, no, that's a lie. More keys just makes things more complicated. Now, not only the client has a key pair, but also the API has a key pair, which is kind of common in a TLS setup. The server has a private key and the client has that public key. So if you connect to a website, the server of that website will have a private key and your browser will know or will have a way to verify the public key of the server, whether it's valid or not. Now we set that up in 2 ways, which allows us to establish a mutual TLS connection, which basically means we establish a TLS connection where both parties present a certificate and verify that they trust that certificate from each other. So this not only means that the client can connect to a server and make sure that it's a real server it's connecting to, the server, in this case the API, will also be able to see which client is connecting and decide, do I want to talk to this client, yes or no? And that's actually really, really beautiful, because now you get the benefits of TLS, you get the confidentiality, the integrity, and the authenticity, and you automatically have an authentication mechanism built in because you can decide whether you want to talk to this client, yes or no. In reality, this is a bit more complicated to set up because of the key management. However, if you figure out the key management, if you have an internal system like a PKI internally where you can issue and create keys and make sure that you can trust them, then this setup is definitely highly recommended. The recipe card of this fancy mechanism. Client and server have a TLS certificate, which embeds the public key, so they also both have a private key. During the handshake, they verify the trustworthiness of the certificates, and this is actually highly recommended for native applications, for any application running on a native OS or native environment. Basically, any server-to-server communication, mobile apps to server communication, this works really well. Browser-based solutions, not so much. Benefits, you get much more security. You also get confidentiality out of the box just by using MTLS. And today, this is supported in most languages and frameworks, which is also really, really good. This used to be a bit obscure, but the OAuth community, which we'll talk about later, is heavily invested in MTLS as a security mechanism, which is also a driver behind much better support in frameworks and languages such as Java and .NET and Node and so on and so on. One important side note, trusting certificates is difficult, but this also works with self-signed certificates. The only thing you need to be able to do is verify whether you trust a certificate. So if you, for example, generate your own certificates and you know like, hey, I generated this particular certificate, this is fine, then you don't need a whole CA with publicly trusted certificates to make this work. That's a very important side note. Drawbacks, this doesn't work well with browsers. In theory, browsers have support for MTLS. In theory, you as a user can import a TLS certificate and use that to set up a TLS connection with mutual TLS, but in practice, it doesn't work very well. Actually, if you're from Belgium, which chances are quite high with this Belgian event, your EID card can set up a mutual TLS connection if you get that hardware thingy and middleware to work. It's a pain to set it up, but in theory, it works. Well, at least it did 10 years ago when I did my master's thesis on that subject. Certificate and key management remain challenging. You'll need to find a way to issue certificates, to generate keys and certificates, to issue them to clients, and so on, which may make things a bit more complicated than they need to be. All right. This mechanism is really good, and a lot of people are using it in practice. And it can be very easy to install or set this up depending on what you're using technology-wise. Here's one example of Istio, a service mesh that has MTLS support built in out of the box. This is an image I grabbed from their architecture, and it's basically they're using MTLS for every piece of server-to-server communication. They have a component called Citadel, which is their CA issuing certificates, so they can automatically provide your containers with the necessary certificates to make sure that your services can use MTLS when they talk to each other. And if you have support like this, implementing MTLS becomes really easy and really straightforward. Absolutely awesome. All right. So far, we mainly talked about client authentication. We mainly talked about how one client can authenticate itself to an API. We haven't really talked about user authentication, and I'm not going to talk about user authentication. However, we'll run into scenarios where a user is involved, and we actually want to know who is calling the API, which user is calling the API. I'm going to talk about a few of these options without talking about how users authenticate. I can give you a hint how that happens in practice, passwords, but you kind of get the idea. There's some other mechanisms as well, but we're going to focus on the API side of things here. So how does authentication work when a user is involved? Well, let's talk about a browser-based application first. What do you do with a web application, a single-page application, Angular, React, Vue, whatever, running in a browser, trying to call an API on behalf of a user? Typically, the scenario looks like this. The user provides credentials, username, password, to the application, or if you're lucky, web authentication or whatever. And the application is going to contact an authentication service. I've drawn this as a separate entity, even though it can be part of the API. That depends on how you implemented this. But essentially, user credentials go to the authentication service, which will verify these credentials and issue, in this case, a cookie. The cookie will be handled by the browser. The browser stores that cookie, which keeps track of the authenticated state of the user. And whenever a request goes to the API, the browser will send that cookie along with that request, allowing the API to make an authorization decision. This is why I call this not really authentication, because we're talking about how to manage authentication state after that first authentication. That's what we're doing right here. So what's happening is the API gets some piece of information. We'll be able to look at that information, decide like, oh, it's Philippe making the call from this Angular app. Yeah, that's fine. We're going to allow that to happen, and the API will respond with the proper response. Awesome, right? Everybody loves cookies. So perfect mechanism. However, this only works well if the API and the authentication service run in the same domain. Cookies are associated with the domain, such as app.resecurity.com or pragmaticwebsecurity.com, and they only work well if you stay within that domain. The browser will not know to send this cookie to a completely different domain running some kind of API. That doesn't work in practice. So cookie-based authentication, basically kind of session management, whether it's stateful or stateless, that doesn't matter here. We're tracking authenticated state of a user here. Cookies work well in certain cases. They work well in browser-based applications running where the authentication service runs in the same domain as the API. So basically, if you are running a simple application, a simple front end contacting an API and nothing else, cookies will probably work really well. Modern frameworks support this, support stateless cookies as well, such as .NET. The .NET world is heavily invested in that, and that is absolutely great. Cookies have a bad security reputation, but modern browsers really fix a lot of these problems, and these challenges are a lot better than they used to be. Drawbacks. Well, cookies only work well in a browser-based environment. If you have a mobile app as a client or a desktop app as a client, cookies will not be your friend, and it will be very painful to try and make it work. Cookies only work within a domain, so if you have APIs spread out over different domains, it's not going to work well. And finally, if you suggest this in your team meeting, like, yeah, we can use cookies here, people will look at you strangely and think you're some kind of dinosaur from the 90s trying to push cookies on APIs. If that's the case, give me a call. I can come and tell them that this actually works really well in the right use case. However, the cool kids will be using something else, and which will not be a cookie. What else do we have? Well, a very similar approach is based on tokens. It basically does the same thing, but we just change the name from cookie to token, and that makes everybody happy and doesn't cause people to frown when you suggest that. So again, the user provides credentials, the client goes to an authentication service to authenticate, receives a token in return, not a cookie, but a token, and attaches that token to outgoing requests to the API. Again, the API can look at the token, decide what's in there, and make its authorization decision before responding to the client. One example is the use of the authorization header with type bearer, as you can see below, which includes a JSON Web Token right here. This is a very common way to implement authentication, again, authentication in modern applications. You'll find plenty of tutorials talking about single-page applications and token-based authentication. What do we have here? The same as with cookies, the user authenticates once to a service, and that authenticated state is then tracked by a token in this case, and not a cookie. Benefits. Works well if you have other types of clients, such as mobile apps, but also works well with JavaScript-based applications. Works across domains, so that's good. That's really good, and doesn't suffer from that limitation from cookies. But it's only very useful in a single application. It doesn't work well the moment you start having multiple APIs, because then your custom solution you're building here will quickly show some flaws that need to be addressed. And another benefit, it makes you look cool if you suggest tokens, because everybody likes tokens and everybody hates cookies for some reason. Drawbacks. Custom code. Almost all of the tutorials talk about custom code on the front end, custom code on the back end, and there's a lot of pitfalls that you can run into when you're implementing something like this. Another drawback is that you'll often find suggestions to keep tokens long-lived, like just make the lifetime 8 hours, 12 hours a week. It's fine, but you lose important mechanisms such as revocation of existing sessions, basically. And a final drawback, securing tokens in browser-based applications is hard, which makes it much more important to be able to stop or terminate a session when you want to revoke a token. And these solutions typically suffer from a lack of the ability to do that. And that brings us to the final technology. In this final technology, we'll basically talk about OAuth, because OAuth is designed to support all of these use cases in a single framework. Granted, it's a complex framework, but the complexity is there because it offers a lot of security features that are necessary if you're starting to build such a system. In a very high-level overview, how does this work? Well, the authentication of the user no longer happens on the client, but happens with the authentication service, which is now an authorization server. So the client informs that authorization server that it will run an OAuth flow, and that authorization server will verify who the user is. It will request the user to authenticate, typically through a web form, using username, password, multi-factor authentication, whatever you see fit. When the user authenticates, the authorization server will issue an access token. And that access token grants the client access to a certain API, which can now make an authorization decision with that token information. If the API is happy, you'll get a positive response. Otherwise, you'll get a negative response. And this looks very similar to the previous token-based approach. And this is also where that token-based approach was extracted from. But OAuth offers much more on the side. It offers refresh tokens, for example. It offers the ability to terminate the issuing of access tokens, to manage lifetimes, to manage access rules, and so on and so on. In practice, you'll often find an access token in the OAuth world as a JSON Web Token, like the one you see on the left, or its decoded version, which you can see on the right. Noteworthy items here is the payload. The payload now includes a set of OAuth claims about what is happening right here. For example, it includes an SUB claim, and the SUB stands for subject, and that's a user's unique identifier. So in this case, the API can decide who's calling this endpoint. Oh, this is Philippe's identifier. Awesome. He's absolutely allowed to do this, so I'm going to go forward with this request. There's also an AZP. That is the client which is making the call. So this token was issued to this particular client application, allowing the API again to make an authorization decision. You'll have audiences integrated there. The audience are the target APIs. So if the client tries to go to a management API with this token, that API will be like, no, this is not me. Go away, please. I'm not honoring this request. And there's an expiration date, which basically limits the lifetime of the token. And this is one of the most important features here. OAuth has support for refresh tokens, which are closely managed by the authorization server, allowing someone to terminate a certain client's access to APIs on behalf of a user. For example, if you grant one of these applications with OAuth access to your Twitter timeline, you can go to Twitter, look at the applications and say like, no, this one is no longer allowed to access my timeline, and you can turn that access off, which is very important as a security measure. All right. Recipe card. OAuth access tokens allow clients to access APIs on behalf of users. The framework around it is heavily invested in asking authorization from the user whether the user wants this to happen. There's token lifetimes, access tokens, refresh tokens, and so on. Benefits. A uniform framework to support different types of clients. Very important, works well with web apps, with mobile apps, with native applications, and so on. This is a framework that a lot of people are working on, working with and working on. So it has a well-defined threat model, which is fairly complex, and there's a bunch of security considerations ready to go to take into account when you're using this. Much better, there's a large ecosystem of libraries that simplify implementation. If you want to use OAuth today, it's really easy to integrate that as long as you know what you are doing. Drawbacks? It's complex to manage. If you have a simple app with a client and an API and nothing more, OAuth is probably going to be overkill for your solution. User authentication involves a browser. That's an OAuth detail, but that's something that marketing teams very much dislike in mobile applications, for example. And it's quite a complicated framework. If you've never used it before, I can guarantee that you will be overwhelmed when you start. Good news, if you want to start, I have an online course about mastering OAuth and OpenID Connect. So if you're interested in diving deeper into OAuth, I suggest you look it up. There's even a discount in the coming week if you sign up with this coupon code. All right, that brings me to this overview slide. All the recipes we talked about are listed on the left. I'm going to give you one line for each of these, which is basically my takeaway message for this presentation. The first thing we talked about was the pizza slice, the simple thing, sending a shared secret like an API key or a username, password, or something like that in the request. This is a simple authentication mechanism. It works really well in a very simple, limited application. For example, if you're building an application, you're calling a second service, which you don't want anybody else to call, use a simple API key. Even a hard-coded key will get the job done. Is it the best practice? Absolutely not, but it gets the job done and it may support what you need. But you should be aware of the limitations there and don't start using it throughout your entire complicated architecture because you're going to regret that decision later on. Asymmetric signatures are a little bit more difficult to implement, but they don't rely on shared secrets, so they're recommended in a bit more complex scenarios, but chances are that you want to move to MTLS in that case anyway. MTLS is a recommendation for service-to-service communication. This should be enabled in your backend architecture because it's really powerful and it locks down the abilities of an attacker in case one of these services is compromised. All right. When the user is involved, we have three options. Cookie-based authentication is recommended when it's a web application contacting a single API living in the same domain. In that case, my recommendation is to use a cookie. Server-side or client-side doesn't matter. Stateful, stateless doesn't matter, but the cookie will work well in that browser-based environment. Token-based authentication is a kind of an unofficial love child between OAuth and cookie-based authentication. It's something that I'm not a big fan of. There's some significant issues with this. So my recommendation is to stay away from that unless you know what you're doing, unless you have a revocable mechanism for tokens. There are a few solutions available, commercial solutions mainly, that offer this. But in general, I would say if you need this kind of authentication mechanism, you probably want to go to OAuth anyway. OAuth is complex but extensive. It supports all of these scenarios. It supports even a few additional scenarios. There's a lot of security recommendations to get this right, and this is recommended in an architecture with multiple clients and multiple APIs. That's basically the takeaway. Again, you can grab the slides from my website if you want to, or you can take a quick screenshot of this slide right now, just to remember what we talked about right here. I'm going to count to 3, and then we'll move on to the wrap up right here. All right. Useful references. Things I talked about in a few cases, the request signing from Amazon, the HTTP signature spec, a few OAuth details where they use authentication with a JOT token or with MTLS, and Istio's security architecture as well. I have a few talks from other venues available on my website as well, so check it out if you want to know more about cookies versus tokens and so on. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. Connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Happy to talk security with you. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them right now. And then we can wrap up this session after that. All right, so one of the questions coming in is, what about OpenID Connect? OpenID Connect is something I haven't talked about because it involves the client. Let me skip back to my OAuth slide for a second. This is a slide about OAuth. OAuth issues an access token in step 4, which is used to access an API. If you talk about OpenID Connect is a protocol to enable user authentication through a third party. So OpenID Connect in this picture would allow the client here to authenticate a user through this authorization server. So when you use OpenID Connect, you would receive user information in step 4, an identity token, which tells the client who this user is. It will contain the user's unique identifier and some additional fields such as a name, an email address, and so on and so on. So OpenID Connect is targeted at authenticating a user to a client, and it's complementary to OAuth, because in combination with OAuth, the client can then access an API on behalf of the user with an access token. So OIDC is never supposed to authenticate a user to an API. It's all about authenticating a user to a client application. If you want to know more, talk to me later or check out the course I have referred to in these slides. All right, another question about the authorization server here. Yeah, OAuth is complicated. So is it bad to have the authorization server endpoints hosted within the API service itself? No, absolutely not. Depends on how you implement this. So for example, if you are using identity server, it's something that's typically integrated into an application. So chances are you're running this inside your API endpoints or namespace. That's perfectly fine. If you're using an external service like Auth0, for example, then you'll typically have this running in a separate domain or separate trust zone. So it depends on the implementation, but there's no real pros and cons about which is better than the other. Is it recommended to use a third-party vendor SaaS product as an authorization server? I have to be careful what I say now. No, absolutely not. There's no reason to go one way or the other. What matters there is your needs for flexibility, I would say. If you go with a vendor SaaS product, such as Auth0 or Okta or Microsoft's Active Directory, you basically rely on the feature set that they provide you. And if that works for you, awesome. You're going to have to pay them to run your identity service, but that's essentially what their business model is. So that's good. That's one way. Another way would be to run your own service with something like Keycloak, which allows you to customize your service in certain ways if you want to do that. And you can even implement something like Identity Server, which gives you even more flexibility. So it's all about that flexibility. The more low level you go, the more close to the code you are, the more modifications you can make. That's basically what you have to take into account. I strongly recommend not to write your own implementation of this authorization server because history has shown that that's the worst idea you can have. Please don't do that because it's not going to end well. Okay, and then all right, so what if you have APIs connecting to additional APIs? That's a very good question. Let me jump back all the way to the beginning here. What if you're in this scenario? Service-to-service communication. How do you forward user authentication? It's called delegation in that case. So what if this API calls that API on behalf of a user? So how would you handle that? Well, there's a couple of options here. If you want to go for the simple approach, my recommendation in most starting points, so most people start with an API gateway or something that is perimeter security, like at the border, they check whether something is allowed, and then each API handles a little bit of authorization, and that's it. So once you're in the system, typically it's like the wild, wild west. You can do whatever you want. And if there's an attacker in there, they can do whatever they want as well. So my first recommendation is to start implementing something like MTLS. Because if you can restrict communication between APIs that are supposed to communicate with each other, you already restrict your system a lot. You already start locking it down of what is possible. If you want to go further, there's an advanced OAuth spec that allows delegation, where you can basically exchange one token, an access token, for another token, which gives you the permission to call another API on behalf of the user. But that's a pretty advanced use case that you often need to grow towards. So my first recommendation is to restrict internal API communication between your APIs to make sure that this API can only call this one and not this one directly if that's what fits in your architecture. Just forwarding tokens is an option. Forwarding user tokens is an option, but that's often called poor man's delegation because it doesn't really buy you a delegation mechanism. It's just forward some information that you have to trust blindly, basically. All right, I answered all the questions. Awesome. And we still have 4 minutes and 30 seconds to spare. If you have any cooking questions, by the way, that you can also ask those. That's perfectly fine. All right, no more questions. Thank you for being here again. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of the event. There's some amazing stuff lined up. So have a nice day, I would say. And maybe we'll talk again soon.